Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Using Data to Optimize Your Markdown Strategy. My name is Holly Pels and I'm with RICH Software and will be your moderator for today's event. We have an exciting and actionable webinar ahead for you today featuring RICH Software's Jimmy RICHBURG and Schuler Shoes' Marie Vidger. But before we get started, there's a few things I wanted to cover. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be made available to you after the event is over. For a better viewing experience, all lines are muted. If you have questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat box in your webinar control panel. Due to time constraints, we will answer all of your questions via email following the webinar. I believe that covers all the small details, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Jimmy to get us started. Jimmy?
Thanks, Holly. So before we dive into the content of the webinar today, I'm going to do just a brief overview of RICH Software for those who may be on who are unfamiliar with us. So RICH is a point-of-sale and inventory management software. We're a 34-year young company. We have about 38 people with a range of expertise from everything from retail to technology and software design. We make, test, sell, and support and consult on the product all in-house in our office in Indianapolis. And we're a cloud-based software as a service program designed for North American footwear and apparel retailers, excuse me. My name is Jimmy RICHBURG and I am the Client Success Director here at RICH. My previous experience was with Fleet Feet Sports. I was with corporate office for 1.5 years and in Fleet Feet in Buffalo for 2.5 years. And I'll allow Marie introduce herself as well.
Marie Vidger, VP of Merchandising at Schuler Shoes. I grew up in the family business and been in this role for 1 year and followed in the footsteps of Leslie Butler after training for a number of years, and look forward to sharing with you today.
Thank you, Marie. So kind of give you an overview of our agenda for the day. So we're going to start by talking about the current state of markdowns in retail and some of the kind of the concepts that go around it, as markdowns are generally a difficult concept for a lot of retailers. One of the reasons is because of a negative perception that markdowns can hold, and then two, also kind of what are some of the industry standards that we're seeing around markdown and markdown strategy. And then from there, we'll move into how to optimize your markdown strategy via some best practice recommendations that we have, as well as utilizing data to help create and implement a markdown strategy in your store. All right, so we'll start by going through the state of markdowns in retail. So 2016 was the year of promotions for retail, where we saw 44% of orders were sold on some type of promotion and 67% of orders were sold on some type of markdown. This level of markdown and discounting resulted in a 24% reduction in margin for a large number of retailers. So the data we're looking at here is based off of analysis of $9 billion worth of transactions globally. So that does include big box and online as well. So we can see that the markdown and the discounting is affecting retailers, both large and small, and e-commerce as well. Because of this high level in markdowns, consumers are starting to suffer from what's being referred to as sales fatigue, where they've grown to have an expectation for some level of markdown anytime they go to shop, and in fact, whether or not there is a markdown available to them will influence their buying decision. So 30% of consumers are willing to go to another store to find a lower price, and on average, these consumers are only willing to pay about 76% of full price in order to actually make a purchase. So it's very clear that, especially with the buying season for the previous year, that markdowns have become increasingly important to customers, and we don't expect that trend to change anytime soon. Despite that, many retailers still struggle with the concept of markdown. So as we'd highlighted before, there are a number of reasons for this. One of which being that retailers don't want to discount too much to the point where they're being seen as a discount retailer or constantly going to have markdowns. And in addition, you don't want to set an expectation for the customer that every time they come in there's going to be some type of markdown or discount available to them. So you want to be able to find a way that you can implement a markdown strategy without giving off that impression to any of your customers. So one thing to think about in terms of the markdowns as well is, retailers wanting to get the most amount of money for every product they sell. Obviously, the higher margin you can get when you sell a product, the better. So they'll tend to hang on to products for longer in hopes that it will sell and sell at full or close to full price. But the reality is when you think about it that this product's already been paid for and the money is already gone for it. So the longer you hang on to specific products without selling them, the more it will take up shelf space for new products that could potentially move faster and sell at full price. So the kind of the new perception we want to have and that we'll highlight today is that markdowns are really a healthy part of any retail business, and when used effectively can help you move through old inventory and keep customers happy and in line with some of the things they've come to expect from their buying experience. So let's quickly highlight why markdowns are important for your store. So thinking about some of your inventory, and this depends a lot on the type of inventory you're looking at, but generally speaking, inventory only has about a 60 to 90-day shelf life. And as I had highlighted before, moving out old inventory makes room for new inventory that will sell at full price. So the longer you're hanging on to old product and not marking it down to try and move it out, the more shelf space it can take up, and the more potential you lose for newer product to come in and be able to sell at full price and move a little quicker off the shelf. So since we've covered a little bit of what's happening in markdowns in terms of retail and kind of the perception that customers now have for retail for markdowns when it comes to their buying experience, we'll talk about how to kind of think about and approach creating and implementing a strategy for your store that doesn't make your customers view as a discount store, and again, doesn't give them that expectation that there's always going to be a markdown available when they come in. So one of the things you want to make sure you do when you're thinking about this is always planning out your strategy before you go into the next selling season. It's very easy and pretty common for some retailers to kind of just mark things down when they feel it's appropriate. If they're in the middle of the season, they realize something isn't moving, and they'll quickly decide to mark it down in an attempt to sell it faster. So going in with a plan and a strategy of how and when you want to mark things down and how you want to make that information available to your customers will help you kind of stay consistent throughout the selling season and ultimately meet your goal of selling as much at full price as you can, and then moving the rest of the inventory out by marking it down. So just some best practices and ideas of things to think about as you go into creating this plan or this strategy. One of the things to consider is limiting the amount of times that you do sales or that you're putting things on sale. So you don't want to be in a situation where you're having some type of sale or event every week in an attempt to get rid of some old inventory or bring customers in. Chances are, if you are needing to have discount product very frequently or having a frequent sale, you may have over-purchased for that particular season unless you're left with excess inventory that you're trying to get rid of. And again, you may be creating an atmosphere where customers don't expect to pay full price for anything, and then the expectation will continue as they come back into the store. Another thing is plan how you can use your marketing channels to tell customers about sales. So ideally, if you're going to put things on some type of sale or markdown, you want to encourage customers to come in and view the inventory and ultimately make a purchase. So if you can utilize some of your customer information to send out emails for customers who have purchased similar items. A good example would be for a pair of shoes that may be updating. You may reach out to customers who have purchased the old model that's about to update and encourage them to come in and purchase the discounted older model before the new one is released. That can help you get rid of some of that excess inventory before the new model comes out, and as well as it can kind of be a different way to engage with your customers and bring them in, especially if they haven't been in the store for a while. Additionally, you can post marked items on social media to help generate some buzz, and again, just try and drive some additional traffic into the store. And as always, when you're thinking about your approach and your strategy around markdowns, you want to make sure you fall in line with industry standards and what's acceptable from the standpoint of marking down and discounting. So the example we call it here is MAP pricing, or minimum advertised price. So making sure that anything that's discounted still inside this period isn't advertised outside of the store. And you know, following all of the rules that surround any of these type of standards. So now we'll go into optimizing your markdown strategy, where we'll start to talk a little bit more about how to utilize data and other ways to approach planning out this strategy. So data is becoming an increasingly powerful tool for all retailers, and it's becoming a big story in terms of not only how retailers are engaging with customers, but how they're planning out their buying, how they're managing their inventory, and ultimately how they can implement a best markdown strategy. So some of the things you want to consider when you're looking at your historical data are, first and foremost, how did you buy for the previous season? So looking at how you bought and then the amount of inventory you had left at the end of that season can give you a good indication of not only how do you need to adjust your buying plan for the next season, but also when you will need to start marking things down to effectively get rid of some old inventory before new styles become available. And then with that historical data, looking at to see when you mark things down for the previous season and see how effective that strategy was. So based off of the end of the season, when new styles would become available, how late or early into the season did you begin to mark product down, and ultimately what was the the inventory you were left with at the end of that season, and how did your margins perform throughout the season? And especially toward the end. So did your strategy allow you to be rid of a majority of inventory that was about to update or change? And were you able to do so in a way that still preserved a high enough margin? And a lot of how you approach that piece of the strategy may be on your open-to-buy plan. So within any open-to-buy, you have basically set aside an amount that you expect to mark down for a given season. So you plan on marking down X amount. So as you're going back for the previous season, looking to see how close you came to meeting your markdown projection, and if you need to make an adjustment as you go into the next season. And as I just highlighted, how did you mark down previously, and how effective was that strategy? So when you're looking at some of your historical data, one of the things you want to highlight is the trends of specific data points and metrics throughout the selling season that you're looking at. So some of the metrics we have called out here are units, dollars, turns, and ROI. Some additional ones would be your margin, as well as the looking at when you discounted and how your discount trended throughout that selling season. So when you're looking at things like turns and ROI, these are very good indicators of how your inventory is performing over the course of the time period you're looking at, especially when you're looking at ROI. So that will show you your return on investment for every product. So looking at to see how products perform early on and toward the middle of the season, and then toward the end of the season based off of when you started marking things down, and ultimately what type of return you were getting. So utilizing these metrics can help you plan out that strategy a little better. Because ultimately you want to make sure that even though you are marking things down, you're still getting the most amount of money back for your investment. So keeping track of when you mark things down, how long they were on markdown, how effective that was, and ultimately how did it affect your key performance indicators such as turns and ROI, can help you plan out that strategy for the upcoming season and hopefully then implement a successful one. So for the data sections, we kind of just did a high-level look at some of the things you can look at. For those of you who are on RICS and are interested in more information about how to utilize RICS to create a Markdown plan and then be able to report and track that information, feel free to submit comments in here or email us after, and we can go into that in more detail. So now I will turn it over to Marie for a few minutes, who will kind of take us through Schuler's approach to markdowns and implementing this type of strategy in their stores.
All right, hi again. This is a picture, in case you're curious, of our main location shoe store on the street level, and then our offices are above. It's in Maple Grove, Minnesota, suburb of Minneapolis, where our 9 retail locations mainly surround the Minneapolis-St. Paul suburbs, and then we do have one in central Minnesota. We're a 4th-generation family-owned and operated company established in 1889, and our focus is on comfort with style, sizes and widths, and most of all, fit and fit. And, for our decision-making for Markdown reporting-wise, we look at each brand depending on that brand every 1 to 4 weeks, and then also kind of cross-review by class at the beginning and end of season, at least, to make sure those seasonal items are being addressed, be able to move through them at the right time. As far as our marketing calendar, we have a set time to send out advertisements as far as markdowns, clearance time of year at the end of each season. Sometimes we give more emphasis, more emails, or extra coupons, added discounts, depending on how much seasonal inventory we have to work through. And we maintain our clearance area all year round by adding items pretty much every week, sometimes a couple times a week during the end of the season push. And then we shift our prices at those annual end of season times and give more incentives that way. And then furthermore, on the details of the data we look at to decide about our markdowns, working mainly from the best worst sellers report, we focus in on the carryover status given from the vendor. We put that in our SKU comments, so it shows right on that report. And then we look at how much we have on hand, how long we've had it, from the age, the gross profit, ROI, and sell-through. And then from there, as needed, when we dig further into an item, pull up inventory inquiry or stock status and see what our size runs look like, and if we have any more on order coming as well. More specifically, for the carryover, if the vendor's going to drop it, we plan when to be out of it in line with the seasonality of that item. For quantity on hand, do wait to mark down if it's tons for each particular store to take into their room and or would look bad to the customers. If it's buried in the same exact booth, they might think something's wrong with it and give them a reason not to buy it. Also, for the age, considering when we first received it, if we've had it at least 30 to 45 days, it's kind of our testing time frame, then we make an action plan from that point, what we can do. Gross profit, the higher the better for being able to afford markdown. ROI-wise, if it's sitting lower than a 1 for at least a few weeks, it's probably just a dud, unless, given if the timing, location, and amount we brought in were all right. If there's no alternative options to marking it down, it just needs to get marked down to free up cash to move on to something else. For sell-through, ideally 70% before we mark down, but at least 50, unless other data points override this. For example, the amount of time you've had it's in along with the seasonality. If it isn't the right time and there's the end of the spring and you're not going to be able to move it because of seasonality, depending on your area, until the next spring, then you might just need to dump it now instead of sitting on that inventory for another 6 months or so. But then on the inventory inquiry for your size runs, if it's broken in the best sizes, might need to mark it down sooner rather than later, even if the other data points don't support it. Our salespeople definitely learn if there's a bad size run, they probably won't go back to it and try to grab it anymore. So it's just going to end up sitting. And then there's the on order. If there's more coming in the next 30, 60 days at the most, we'll just wait for more to come in. And then if it's going to be longer, sometimes mark it down just to clean up if it's just a little bit left, and then start back over when those new orders come in. So that's the info I have for you today. Hope that's helpful.
All right. Thank you, Marie. I appreciate you jumping on and sharing some of your best practices and your thoughts today. So, one of the things I want to call out from the things Marie was talking about is that clearly there are a lot of different factors to consider when you're planning out and implementing the strategy. And as you plan out, if you planned out a strategy and then you go into the season, being cognizant of the different, variables and the different data metrics to basically make an adjustment when you need to, or stick with the plan depending on how things are performing, and keeping in mind things like, is it the right type of product for where you are and for your customer base? So again, a lot of different things to consider. Ultimately, what you want to do is find a strategy that works best for you. And then what we'll do through this next section here is talk about just some best practices, again, of ways to think about, approach, and implement this type of strategy within your store. So as we called out earlier, inventory has generally a 12-week cycle, again, depending on the type of product that you're evaluating. But ultimately, you want to be evaluating the products pretty regularly as they're selling on the floor to see what's performing and what's not. If you see something that's not selling, you want to kind of evaluate what might be the driving force behind that. So as Marie called out, they look at things, deciding whether or not it's the right product fit for where they are and for who their customers are. And if that's the case, and if it's something that's just not doing well for one reason or another, you want to start marking it down so that you can move that inventory out and make room for something that would sell a little better and at full price in the store. Additionally, marking down final items of style to make room for new inventory. So especially as you get towards the end of a selling season when you're going to have new product, you want to make, and you have, a handful of a specific item left, you want to mark those products down and move them out as quickly as possible so that you can make room for that new inventory, have full shelf space for that inventory, so you can make sure you're selling the most that you can at full price. And then a little bit kind of adding on to that, marking it down in season. So really what the takeaway point here is that you're evaluating your sales throughout the course of a specific selling season, and you're identifying, when and if specific items are selling or not, and then marking it down as appropriate, and not necessarily waiting until the very end of the season to mark things down and then try and move it out all at once. Be aware of how things are performing in the store, look at it regularly, and make adjustments to your plan as you go through the season. And then, of course, using data to understand the right time for markdown. So we highlighted a little bit how you can utilize your historical data, and that's both in your buying as well as your selling for a particular season. How did you buy, and how did those products perform? What were you left with at the end? And then how did those products perform? When did you start marking things down? And how did that overall strategy work when it came to seeing what inventory you had left and getting ready for the next season to start? So utilizing your data from the previous season or even seasons to add some trend to it, you can create kind of benchmarks for where you would expect to need to start marking things down when you want to be out of specific inventory. I think Marie highlighted a few things where they want to be totally out of a specific style if the vendor's dropping it. So keeping in mind the situation around specific products. And creating benchmarks and working toward hitting those marks as you go through the season. And also making sure you're regularly keeping up with how things are performing while in season. Historical data is great to help give you an idea of what you might expect for this season and help you plan, but ultimately the decisions you make day in and day out are going to be based off of what's happening in the store today. So keeping up with inventory performance, identifying what is selling and what is not, and then deciding how you want to best mark it down and market that to the customer. So depending on the research that you look at, it's a variation of what the best recommended markdown percentage is to start off an initial sale or discount or markdown. So, from some of the things we found is marking down at least 20%, but looking at information from Bob Bibbs, the retail doc, his recommendation is starting it at 30% off. And then, of course, alerting customers that these items are available and mentioning that they're a limited selection to kind of entice people to come in. Ultimately, what you want to do is, again, find the strategy that's going to work best for you, but research shows that, at least 20 to 30% is what's going to entice the customer enough to want to make a purchase, and also will not impact your margins too much early on in the markdown process. Another thing you can do within the store is to designate a clearance section. So having a clear difference between your clearance items and your full price items, and clear signage to indicate to customers where that section is in the store. It's also helpful to locate that clearance section toward the back of the store, because that would require customers to walk all the way through the store viewing some of the current and full price items before they reach the clearance section. Within that clearance section, you may consider utilizing price point tables, where you have a situation where anything on a particular table would be $10, for example. It makes the buying decision a little bit easier for the customer, because instead of looking through and identifying the price and the amount of markdown for a particular product, they know everything on one particular spot or on one table is going to be a certain dollar amount. So it takes a little bit of the work off of them and makes it easier for them to make that buying decision. And as we highlighted earlier on here, limiting when you're doing sales, so focusing on things like semi-annual sales that you can promote and make them a big event in the store. Not only will it drive some increased customer traffic to your store during that time frame, but also it doesn't set that expectation for your customers that you're regularly going to have these types of sales and events, and that things will regularly be on markdown. And also, utilizing those sales and your clearance section to help clear out some of those end of season styles so that you can prepare to bring in new fresh inventory for the next season. And finally, knowing when to donate product. It's always a great incentive to use old merchandise as a free gift to customers. A great way to reward a loyal customer for coming in and shopping, and also get rid of just some excess inventory that just doesn't seem to be selling and is really only taking up space on the shelf. And then also donating to charitable organizations for a tax benefit is another way you can consider getting rid of some of that excess inventory. If you've gotten to the end of the season, your markdown strategy didn't eliminate everything, and you still want to be able to get rid of it somehow. So throughout this presentation, we highlighted the current state of markdowns in retail. What we're finding is that customers now have a much higher expectation for the frequency of markdowns as they're making buying decisions. And it's also created an expectation around how much they're willing to spend and what they're willing to do in order to find a discounted product. And again, that's in everything from small business to big box and e-com. And we also highlighted how you can begin to think about, approach, and implement a markdown strategy within your store. First, by utilizing some of your historical data from a buying and a sales perspective, and then following your data as during the current selling season, and then creating a plan that will best suit both you in your business as well as your customers. So that is all I have for you today. As Holly mentioned at the beginning, any questions that were added will be answered afterward, and feel free to reach out to me at any time. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jimmy. We want to take a quick second to thank Marie from Schuler Shoes for participating in today's event. And as Jimmy just mentioned, we will be answering any of the questions that you guys have submitted or that you submit via email following this webinar. We have also recorded the webinar, so be sure to look for that in your inbox in the next couple of days. Thank you guys so much for joining us today, and we hope you have a great day.